2019, a company that rented desks was valued higher than Boeing, higher than Ford, higher than Marriott, Hilton, and Hyatt combined. The company had never made a profit, not once. It was bleeding $219,000 every single hour of every single day. And the man running it had just told journalists that his personal goal was to live forever and become the world's first trillionaire. His name was Adam Neumann, and what he built was either the greatest business revolution of the 21st century or the most expensive illusion Wall Street ever bought. This is the story of WeWork. To understand how WeWork collapsed, you first have to understand what it was actually selling, and the answer is not office space. In 2010, Adam Neumann was a 31-year-old Israeli immigrant with a failed baby clothes company behind him and a talent for talking people into things. He met Miguel McKelvey, a laid-back architect from Oregon, in a Brooklyn co-working space. The two of them noticed something. Freelancers, startups, and small companies all needed office space, but couldn't afford long-term leases. Landlords wanted stability and hated short commitments. There was a gap in the middle. The idea was simple. WeWork would sign long-term leases, renovate spaces into hip open-plan offices with beer taps and exposed brick walls, and sublet them at a premium to small companies who paid month to month. A classic arbitrage model. Borrow long, rent short, make money on the spread. By any normal measure, that's a real estate business. Margins are thin, growth is slow, and it's deeply tied to the economy. When recessions hit, companies cut office space first. But Adam Neumann didn't want to run a real estate company. He wanted to run a religion. From the very beginning, Neumann understood that perception was more powerful than profit. He studied what made Silicon Valley startups attract billions, and he copied it with surgical precision. He called WeWork a community company. He said his mission was to elevate the world's consciousness. He told investors he was building a physical social network. The language was intoxicating, and it worked. By 2014, WeWork had raised $150 million at a $1.5 billion valuation. Real estate investors would have never paid that price, but tech investors, who had spent a decade watching software companies turn losses into empires, opened their checkbooks without asking hard questions. Neumann had figured out the arbitrage that mattered most, not office space, but narrative. He cultivated a cult of personality with breathtaking skill. He showed up to investor meetings barefoot. He held all-hands company meetings that felt more like music festivals, with live bands, tequila shots, and staff who genuinely believed they were changing the world. He flew in a private jet he nicknamed Gulfstream One. He signed WeWork leases to buildings he personally owned, then charged WeWork rent, a conflict of interest so brazen that it would later become Exhibit A in SEC investigations. He also started spending on a scale that defied all logic. WeWork flew all 6,000 of its global employees to a company retreat in England. The food and drinks bill alone ran $11.6 million for 4 days. Employees described it as an open bar that ran from 10 a.m. to 4 a.m. 1 year later, WeWork announced it was banning meat from all company events, citing environmental values. The retreat still happened. The tequila still flowed. None of this was hidden. It was celebrated. Then came SoftBank, and everything got worse. In 2017, Masayoshi Son, the founder of Japan's SoftBank, met Adam Neumann for exactly 28 minutes. Not in a boardroom, in the back of a car. After that ride, Son committed $4.4 billion to WeWork. He later said he preferred crazy founders. He called Neumann a genius. The check changed everything. WeWork's valuation jumped to $20 billion, then $35 billion. Then $47 billion by early 2019. With that kind of money, Neumann went into full expansion mode. WeWork was opening locations in every major city on Earth. They acquired a wave pool company called WaveGarden. They bought a private elementary school called WeGrow, where Neumann's wife, Rebecca, who held the title of Chief Brand and Impact Officer, implemented a curriculum built around the power of me. They invested in a company making wave-powered jet skis. They launched We Live, a co-living apartment concept. They even explored buying the Empire State Building. Between 2016 and 2019, WeWork's annual losses went from $430 million to $1.9 billion. Revenue was growing, yes, from $436 million to $1.8 billion. But for every dollar WeWork made, it spent $2. The company's own financial disclosures showed something that became infamous across every business publication in the world. WeWork had invented a new metric for measuring its performance. They called it Community Adjusted EBITDA. It was a standard profitability measure, except with expenses like marketing, general administration, and building operations removed. In other words, a measure of profitability that excluded most of the costs of running the business. It appeared in official documents submitted to regulators, not as a draft, as the final version. By 2019, WeWork needed more cash. The company had burned through billions and was locked into long-term lease obligations totaling $47 billion, nearly equal to its own valuation. To keep running, it needed to go public. In August 2019, WeWork filed its S-1 prospectus, the document companies submit before an IPO. On Wall Street, S-1s are dry, technical, and written by lawyers terrified of liability. WeWork's S-1 opened with a poem. It went downhill from there. Analysts started reading, and the reaction was immediate. The document revealed that Neumann had borrowed $380 million against his own WeWork shares. He had trademarked the word "we" personally, then sold that trademark back to WeWork for $5.9 million, which he only returned after a wave of public outrage. His wife, Rebecca, held veto power over his successor in the event of his death. And then, the line that ended up in every headline. The S-1 mentioned the word community 150 times, a clear path to profitability 0 times. Scott Galloway, a marketing professor at NYU, published an analysis that tore through every financial newsroom in the world. He called WeWork's valuation the greatest destruction of value by a founder in history. He put the real value of the business, stripped of story, stripped of narrative, at somewhere between $10 and $12 billion. The IPO was scheduled for September 2019. The target valuation, $47 billion. Investment banks launched their roadshow, the meetings where executives pitched the stock to institutional investors. Investors were not interested. Not at $47 billion, not at $30 billion, not at $20 billion. Within weeks, the target price had collapsed to exactly what Galloway had predicted. WeWork withdrew the IPO entirely. In 47 days, the company's estimated value had fallen by $37 billion. What followed was a demolition in slow motion. Within weeks of the IPO collapse, WeWork's board, finally, after years of silence, moved to remove Adam Neumann as CEO. He had too many shares with supervoting rights to be simply fired, so they negotiated. SoftBank paid Neumann a $185 million consulting fee and bought out a portion of his shares for $970 million. The man who had destroyed nearly $40 billion in value walked away personally enriched by over $1 billion. He reportedly spent part of it on a Gulfstream G650 private jet, an upgrade from the one he already had. The company he left behind was in freefall. WeWork had over 700 locations across 38 countries, locked into leases averaging 15 years in length. Its revenues were real, but far too small to cover its obligations. By October 2019, it was burning through cash so fast that executives internally estimated the company had weeks of liquidity remaining. SoftBank, which had already poured $10 billion into WeWork and had no good options left, extended an emergency credit line. In 2021, WeWork finally went public, not through a traditional IPO, but through a SPAC merger, the financial equivalent of using the back door because the front door is locked. The valuation, $9 billion. In 2023, WeWork filed for bankruptcy. The valuation at the time of filing, approximately $44 million, from $47 billion to $44 million, in 4 years. So, what exactly went wrong? Because it wasn't just one thing. First, the business model was structurally fragile in a way Neumann actively hid. WeWork's core vulnerability was a duration mismatch. It signed 15-year leases and sold monthly memberships. When COVID hit in 2020 and companies vacated offices overnight, WeWork's expenses didn't move. Its revenue evaporated. The company had built a skyscraper on a foundation designed for a beach house. Second, Neumann weaponized investor psychology. He understood that in the era of blitz scaling, the Silicon Valley doctrine of growing at all costs to capture markets, losses were features, not bugs. Amazon lost money for years. Uber lost money for years. Neumann sold the story that WeWork's losses were investment, not incompetence. The difference he never acknowledged. Amazon and Uber had software at the core of their businesses. Software scales infinitely. Office leases don't. Third, the The governance was non-existent. Neumann held super voting shares that gave him effective control over all major decisions. The board was stacked with people who owed their positions to him, or to SoftBank. For years, there was no independent check on anything he did. Not the self-dealing leases, not the $60 million he pulled out of the company to fund personal real estate purchases, not the tequila-soaked retreats, while the company bled cash. And fourth, the most expensive mistake of all, SoftBank kept writing checks. Masayoshi Son had publicly committed to WeWork. His vision fund had built its entire thesis around it. Admitting the investment was wrong meant admitting the fund's judgment was wrong. So instead of pulling back, they doubled down, and then doubled down again. The result was a company that should have hit a wall at a $5 billion valuation, being kept alive long enough to reach $47 billion, making the eventual crash that much more catastrophic for everyone involved. The numbers at the end of this story are staggering in their specificity. SoftBank lost approximately $14 billion on WeWork. JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and other banks that had been lined up to underwrite the IPO walked away from hundreds of millions in expected fees. Thousands of WeWork employees lost jobs, equity, and in many cases health insurance. The company's largest landlords absorbed billions in unpaid or renegotiated rent. And Adam Neumann, in 2022, he launched a new startup, a residential real estate company called Flow. Andreessen Horowitz, one of Silicon Valley's most respected venture funds, gave him $350 million at a $1 billion valuation. Before Flow had a single operating building. The pitch, community-centered living. The mission, redefining the relationship between people and their homes. He was selling the exact same idea, in the exact same language, to the exact same kind of investors. Maybe that's the real lesson of WeWork. Not that Adam Neumann was a fraud, courts have never established that. Not that SoftBank was naive, they made the same bet dozens of times, and won often enough to survive. The lesson is simpler and stranger. WeWork proved that in the right moment, with the right language and the right energy, you can convince the most sophisticated financial institutions in the world to fund a story, not a business, a story, at $47 billion. WeWork was the most expensive story ever told, and someone always has to pay for the ending.